petroleum and other things to these countries here, our allies. So Somalia developed an interesting, was of great interest. So when I was working on the Horn, I had to go to Ethiopia also. Where is Ethiopia? Before Eritrea existed. Eritrea, as you know, is a part of former Ethiopia. They speak Tigrinya, they don't speak Amharic, etc. So Somalia was then with the Soviets when the Soviet Union existed. And then they switched to be with the Yanks, with the Americans, right? And the Ethiopians switched, you know, Mengistu and all of this sort of thing, because we didn't like his dictatorship and so forth. So we were dealing with a country that of nomadic people. Mogadishu is what maybe Spanish Town looked like in 1944, if you can imagine. Where are we? Yeah, Somalia. And then you have this Somalia, strategically important, the Horn of Africa, switching sides between East and the West at the time, having a dictatorship, and the dictator came from one of the small clans, the Marihan. The major clans are the Hawiyas and the Majertain. And then they are not sub-Saharan people, but in the heart of Somalia, down here, going towards Kenya, the area called the Ogaden. They fought a war over the Ogaden between Ethiopia and Somalia. So all of that is to say you had to know who made the decisions and what the state of relations should be between the United States and Siad Barre in terms of the US interest in that geographic position and the switch from the Soviets to us. That involved establishing a military base in Somalia in a place called Hargeisa. Hargeisa, up in the north, what is now Somaliland. I landed in Hargeisa from Mogadishu in a Fokker. I said Fokker. And when I arrived there in Hargeisa, they just put my bags in the middle of a field and disappeared. Right? Luckily for the United Nations, there were some people there to pick me up from, dealing with refugees. And I had to see the son-in-law of the dictator, Hashigani, in this godforsaken place way up here. And Hashigani was supposed to meet me in a military camp to have breakfast with me. They usually have liver and onions for breakfast up there. And sweet tea. I thought I was in the South. But in any event, he didn't turn up. So I was waiting there with this UN driver for this man in this place. And we decided that we couldn't wait anymore because my flight was due back to Mogadishu. When I arrived at the airport, waiting for my flight, a jeep pulled up in the middle of the tarmac with Hashigani and 3 guys with some weapons on their shoulders. And they came to me, and I had a translator there from the UN, and he said to me, he didn't say, Mr. American diplomat, he says, in his language, Somali, get inside. So I went to Woolmer's, I learned some discipline. I mean, I could have been caned if I said that by Doc Simpson, right? So I'm representing a powerful country, but I'm in Hargeisa, and he's the son-in-law, he's married to the dictator's daughter. What would you do in that situation? You paid attention. So he started to lecture me that the United States always makes the wrong decision of supporting the wrong people. Something I heard from Ferdinand Marcos some years later. And he said, you don't understand this area of the world. He's telling me this, right? And I thought I was a pretty competent guy. He said, you don't understand this, and you're continuing to you need to be more supportive of my father-in-law, Siad Barre, and his interests. 2 people came to see him and whispered to him in earshot of my translator, saying the plane is full and people want to get moving. And people are sweating beads in there. So let me tell you, I mean, Somalia is not Atlanta today, right? So he just did like this. So he chatted and lectured me, and then he accompanied me to the plane, right up the stairs. There are hundreds of people waiting in the airport. I don't know what they're doing there. And he stood in the middle of the tarmac before we got up onto the plane and started, lecturing me there. Then we went up the stairs, and when we went in, of course, people were frying. Guess what happened? When I got to Mogadishu, the news item in Mogadishu was there was an attempted plot to kill Hashigani. Yeah, it was on the news, and Washington was picking it up and all of that and sending in these WikiLeaks cables right away, saying, is Scarlett all right to use up there and so forth. Because he used me as a decoy, and he used my presence to stand in front of all of the people at the airport and on the flight in order that he was alive and safe and well. Well, I'd been used before, but I had never been used in Hargeisa before. What does that mean to me? It means that you have to always understand your environment. And I was in a situation where I had to go to the nub to find out for Washington what was really transpiring in a country that we had shifted from not supporting into supporting. Siad Barre came to Washington. The dictator came to Washington. And I had to prepare the briefs for people with whom he was going to talk. And I had to write some very straight up, honest perspectives on the situation there. But we met with the dictator. What did I have to do in order to gain some credibility with the opposition to Siad Barre? They would come to the State Department to see me. But I could not meet them in the State Department because we had a relationship with a friend who was in a strategically well-located place. So I used to go to a place, you might know it in Washington, it's near the Watergate, called Howard Johnson. I would go there to have these conversations with oppositionists to Siad Barre. Now, it puts you in a kind of perceived duplicitous role, but it's not, in fact, because there was a transition. It's not necessary for the best now in Somalia, but you have to be able to manage these situations in terms of what is perceived to be in the interests coming from above. The second case, Barbara, you ready? Okay, come.
Well, aside from, I hope you can hear me, I had 15 days of laryngitis before, so I'm not a big projector, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about public diplomacy and its role, another one of our tools, in its role in explaining America, getting a reaction from the host country to our policies. Public diplomacy is central to that. It is the people-to-people exchange. Oh, grand, thanks. It's the people-to-people exchange, and something that we value since the beginning of in the 30s, when we talked about the need for peoples working together to establish mutual understanding and perhaps international cooperation. It's one of our stronger elements, and it's one of the least controlled, we could say. And I was very proud to be part of that loose element. One of the things that happened in the Philippines, of course, as you all know, we could see a change coming after the assassination of Ninoy Aquino. And we realized with the population being so young in the Philippines and very vulnerable, that they didn't know anything about democratic society, that 2 generations had grown only to know dictatorship. So what was the role now? Of course, a lot of anthropology and who's doing what and how many groups are being influential and what are the established leaders. The role of public diplomacy was to establish who were the potential leaders. And we had, from the very established parties to what I call the black pajama groups, and those that were involved in the communist revolutions or activities, and the Moral Liberation Front, that this merging Islamic thrust that was in the southern part of the Philippines. That population, the Philippines, very diverse, very young, all the institutional analysis, which institution should we know, which people should we know. If the president comes here, and believe you me, Ronald Reagan loved Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos. There was no conversation that this was his boy, his democratic boy. He used all kinds of terms. Those of us on the ground were seeing bodies floating up during the monsoon time, people disappearing and hearing of torture. And we could see this growing antagonism to an old regime that had been heavily backed and continued to be backed by the United States for a variety of reasons, notwithstanding 2 very large military bases. So we said, okay, the official political officers, they deployed all over the country, understood the leaders that were in place, met the potential leaders along the way, but we needed to engage them. So in my role as a cultural officer, my role was to explain America, demonstrate America, discuss America's image, discuss America's model, and to see their reaction to it, and at the same time, help that country, for our benefit, understand us when we talked about things democratic. So I put together a series of seminars in which we talked constitution writing, campaigning in democratic parties, how the legislative branch worked, the Congressional Research Service, the role of joint committees, as I mentioned, the role of senior staff versus political staff, all the steps that make a difference in a democracy for participation. I asked each political party, including the Black Pajama Group and the Communist Group, to please send their 3rd tier representative in the party, that we were going to conduct this, and I wrote a very open letter to all of those party chair people. And they did send them, but when they came for the first talk, which was Virginia's Constitution, which was revised many times before it was in its final state, those people knew each other somewhat, but didn't like each other. And in fact, if left alone, they probably would have killed each other. So, in politeness, they sat in strategic points all over the auditorium, but not together. And my job was to turn this into an intellectual exercise and give them language and give them opportunities to confront each other, take a pause on how they think about each other, and most of all, like us, get to know each other. That group was very faithful to the 13 or so seminars, if you can imagine. And then I devised a program that we have called the International Visitor Program. The International Visitor Program, if you're ever invited by the ambassador to come and study an issue in the United States, it looks like a free trip for 3 weeks roaming around. But the seeds that that individual drops in those individual communities in America help shape the image that those ordinary Americans have about your country, Jamaica, in this case, the Philippines. And what we did was to pull a group of 13 of the most articulate including the man that everyone thought was totally illogical from the Communist Party. He was not a university-educated man. He had very strident ways, and his behavior was not at all middle class, as many of the others. But they went off to the United States together. They went to various uncontrolled neighborhoods from Native American communities to Harlem, to the Jewish synagogue on a Friday, looking at America and trying to understand our way of approaching democracy, trying to compare that to theirs. They formed a very nice friendship as a result, and they started with their conversation and impact by visiting in Washington in the White House. The White House had a certain view of the Philippines, and they weren't accepting any other, but we hammered away. That particular group was one of 300 people that we sent to the United States on a variety of issues. When I arrived, we were sending 12. That's how unimportant the Philippine population perhaps was from the point of view of the Americans. Well, the long and the short of the story is the revolution came, and a new government was established under Cory Aquino, and there are lots of stories under that. Because I had done this program, this is an aside, the revolution came to my door in the middle of the protest and said, "We need to discuss something with you, Barbara. We trust you most. Can you advise us? We're going to strafe the palace tomorrow, settle all of Marcos's planes, and then we'd like to refuel in Clark Air Base. And by the way, we're going to take Cory Aquino to Bataan and establish a new government there." And I said, boy, I'm not perfect, I'm not anthropological or historical on this, but didn't we lose Bataan? What do you mean taking Cory Aquino there, etc. We joked, they talked, they developed their strategy, and being a good Southern girl from civil rights days, I fed them both liquor and food all night, as long as they wanted to talk. And then I asked Earle to come, and the political military officer, who is the bridge between revolution and military strike.
Where was I at that time?
You were in the palace, in the embassy, shredding all of documents because we were sure the revolution was coming since everybody was outside. But we came and we tried to talk them out of that. Next day, sure enough, they did shred the planes of Marcos and the palace. They did land at Clark Air Base, and they did ask for refueling. And the military attaché, when I saw the planes fly, I ran into his office, and he looked at me, ladies, like, what's this little girl doing in here, all dolled up? And I said, I know who's flying. And he said, Barbara, the line is open to the Pentagon. I don't have time for this now. What do you mean? I said, I know who's flying. He had dinner with me last night. He's the leader of the reform movement. He's flying, and he's on his way to Clark Air Base. What are you talking about? Why didn't he come to me? I said, you need to ask that question. So public diplomacy put us in a place where we were building trust by exposing America's warts, exposing America's process, and in the meantime, giving people some kind of structure for the new democratic posture that the Philippines assumed after the revolution. Ironically, my 13 took their place as secretary generals in every ministry. So what did that mean? It meant that they had direct links to the American embassy if they had questions, and we with them. It meant that they had links in the United States if they needed technical development or information. They had made friends. It's a very powerful tool, public diplomacy, and it's a side that often isn't discussed because it gets muddled with short-term impact of press. What happened? What did we say? America said this. This medium-term, dynamic, uncontrolled tool that we use to prepare for crises, take a pause in crises, and perhaps even resolve them, is very vital. And the long-term effort that we make through the Fulbright Exchange accomplishes the same thing. This people-to-people arrow in our quiver is something that it's been our strongest, and since 1938, been our most effective tool for communication.
I'm sold on public diplomacy because I've seen it do so many great things for us when the hard realpolitik doesn't work sometimes, when you have to deliver the message. And there's a tool that we have in diplomacy called the démarche. The démarche is a fancy French word for when you're proposing to a foreign government a position. You have various techniques. You have things called a white paper, a blank paper. It has nothing on it, but you just deliver it or whatever. And there are different weights of communication, you know, and level of communication with the host government carries a certain amount of weight. Diplomats know this is a common, it's like a language. But the démarche is sometimes very tough on you. When you have to go in and tell the government that we're going to cut off the aid tomorrow, or very soon, unless you do something. It's a tough reality. And these démarches, these instructions are hammered out in Washington in an interagency setting. This is often lost in the conversation that instructions or directions in policy are just concocted in the White House or in the State Department. There's a big interagency operation going on. And when those instructions over blood, sweat, and tears are hammered out and sent to you, then you have to act. Sometimes we are very clever because we are schooled in this matter. We'll send back a message saying, we don't think it's the most opportune time to raise this question. But you can't just offer your view. You have to have a compelling argument that if we raise this question, they are going to have a quid pro quo and ask you to do something. So a dialogue is there. But when you resist instructions from Washington, you have to be able to marshal strong arguments to convince those decision makers in Washington that it's not a good idea now. Timing is a big thing in diplomacy. Timing, like in most things in life. When do you do what? Crisis situations we should mention. I'll just add one thing to Barbara's graphic account. We had the two largest military bases she mentioned, two largest overseas. Right now, there's a crisis in the South China Sea, as I told you, with this discrepancy going on for ownership there. And it's just not ownership of some small islands, it's access, as I mentioned. So, if you remember, the timing also, this was in the mid-80s when there was still a Soviet Union with interests in Southeast Asia. Let's move to another example. Let's look at the situation in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was a country formed in 1918 by Yugoslavs. But the Yugoslavs, Yugo in Serbo-Croatian means south, South Slavs, right? And the Slovenes, the Croats, and the Serbs decided to fashion this country after the Second World War. And there emerged a very important man in history, Marshal Tito. When Marshal Tito, albeit a communist, was able to bring together under his umbrella these contending tribes, European tribes. It's a hard idea for people to understand. When I was in Yugoslavia and I'd say to my friend, but you're tribes. You're the Croats versus the Serbs versus the Macedonians and so forth. So after Tito died in 1980, and by the way, his name was not really Tito. That was just a nickname. His name was Joseph Broz. And Joseph Broz was a half Croat and half Slovene. But anyhow, he emerged, and we loved him, we Americans, because he defied Stalin. Stalin was not even a Russian. I think Stalin was a Georgian. But in the Soviet Union, it was the Soviet Union. And so we were, attracted to Tito for that. And then Tito led a very important movement. It was a part of the non-aligned movement that brought together Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Toure, Nehru, Nasser, Suharto, and various leaders of the world under this so-called third way during the struggle between the Soviet Union and the United States. So that is the background to this